Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really getting into British educational policy.
That's right.
It's a big topic, especially crucial if you're prepping for A-level sociology exams.
Absolutely essential, yeah. It can seem pretty overwhelming.
Definitely. So we're using British educational policy framework and evolution as our base today.
Mm,
And our mission really is to pull out the key themes, the big historical shifts, and importantly, the sociological ideas you really need for those exams.
exactly. We want to give you a solid framework, not just, you know, a list of policies.
Right.
It's about understanding how it all fits together, especially through that lens of equality that's so central to sociology.
Okay, so let's start right there. For those A-level students listening, what exactly is educational policy? We hear the term all the time,
Yeah.
but what does it actually mean in practice?
Well, simply put, they're the government's strategies, their plans for how schools should work,
Or
what they aim to achieve, how they're structured, how education is actually delivered day to day.
And these plans are influenced by.
All sorts. National priorities, obviously, but also global trends play a big part now.
Right, okay. So zooming out a bit, what are the main goals? What are these policies fundamentally trying to do?
The source points to three really core aims. First, there's economic efficiency.
Skills for the workforce, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Making sure the education system produces people with the skills the economy needs. Second, raising standards.
Improving teaching, learning outcomes.
Yeah, constantly trying to push up the quality of teaching and what students actually learn. And third, and this is probably the big one for sociology, A-level, is equality of educational opportunity.
Ah, okay. So striving for fair access and, importantly, fair outcomes for all students.
Precisely. Regardless of their background, that's the ideal anyway.
That phrase, equality of educational opportunity, it sounds simple, but I know sociology tells us it's complex. The source mentions Gilborn and Udell's 4 dimensions. That seems really useful for A-level.
Oh, absolutely. Their framework is brilliant for breaking it down. They talk about 4 key aspects.
Okay.
First, equality of access. Does everyone have the same chance to get into a good non-selective school?
Makes sense.
Then equality of circumstance. This is about the starting point.
Yeah.
Do kids begin with similar home backgrounds, similar resources, which is, a huge factor.
Definitely. What's next?
Equality of participation. Once they're in school, do all students engage equally? Do they feel part of it?
Right, the experience within the school itself.
Exactly. And finally, equality of outcome. Do all students actually get the same long-term benefits from their education? Does it lead to similar life chances?
That's a really clear breakdown. What strikes me, though, and the source points this out, is how policy often seems to focus heavily on that first one access.
Yes.
Like, the others, especially circumstance, seem harder for policies to directly tackle.
That's a really critical point for A-level analysis. You're right. Improving access, you can sort of legislate for it, change admission rules, build schools.
Right, it seems more concrete.
It does. But tackling unequal circumstances, that means dealing with poverty, social class differences, things rooted deep in society's structure.
Much harder.
Much harder for educational policy alone to fix. It opens up that big sociological debate.
Yeah.
How much can schools really compensate for wider societal inequalities?
A massive question. Okay, so bearing that complexity in mind, let's look at some policies aimed at access. The tripartite system comes up. Feels like ancient history, but its ghost still lingers, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. You can't understand the current system without it. Introduced in 1944, the aim was free secondary education for all. Good intention. But it sorted kids via the 11+ exam into grammar, technical, or secondary modern schools. And that exam, well,
Became a massive social sorter.
pretty much. It disproportionately favored middle-class kids for the grammar schools, often limiting pathways for working-class children. It really fueled the debate about selection that we still have today. Key A-level stuff.
And that system eventually gave way to the comprehensive system, which is more or less what we have now, although it's not that simple either.
No, definitely not simple. The move towards comprehensives from the 70s aimed to ditch that 11+ selection. Have one school type for all local kids.
A level playing field was the idea?
That was the aim. But as you say, the system's evolved. Now we have academies, free schools, faith schools, all sorts operating under the comprehensive banner.
So formally non-selective, mostly, but with lots of variation in practice.
Exactly. Different freedoms, different admission setups. It creates new kinds of inequality, which is another thing sociology students need to analyze.
Right. Now, what about policies trying to address those unequal circumstances? The source mentions it's tricky, but there were things like education action zones, excellence in cities,
Yeah, those are examples of what we call compensatory education policies.
trying to make up for disadvantage.
Kind of. They targeted extra resources, specific programs, at schools in disadvantaged areas to try and boost achievement.
And more recently.
The pupil premium, introduced around 2010, that gives schools extra money specifically for students from poorer backgrounds, those on free school meals,
Mm.
or looked after children.
And thinking critically, like an A-level student, does the pupil premium actually work? Does it close that gap?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And one you definitely need to explore for your exams.
Okay.
The evidence is, well, it's mixed. It's debated. Does the extra funding consistently make a big enough difference? It depends on how schools use it, and crucially, it's happening against that backdrop of wider inequality outside the school gates.
Yeah, context is everything. Which brings us neatly to selection again, but maybe the less obvious kind. The source talks about covert selection. What's that about? Most schools can't officially select by ability, can they?
Formally, no.
Hmm.
Apart from the remaining grammars, state schools generally aren't supposed to select by ability or social background.
But
The source highlights these subtler ways schools might discourage certain families from applying or make it harder for them. That's covert selection.
okay, this is where the sociology gets really sharp. Give us some examples. How does this covert stuff actually work?
Sure. Think about a school's promotional material. Does the language used maybe subtly suggest it's not for families from certain backgrounds?
Like using really complex jargon.
Exactly. Or think about really expensive uniform policies. That's a barrier for low-income families right there.
Okay, yeah.
Or maybe complex admission forms, or not advertising open days widely in less affluent areas. Even how catchment areas are drawn, or how admission criteria within the rules are weighted, can sometimes favor families with more, know-how or resources.
So it's about looking beneath the surface, seeing how class still shapes access even without an 11-plus death,
Are-
vital for A-level.
Absolutely vital. It shows the gap between policy intention and the lived reality for many families.
Okay, let's shift gears slightly. What are the big forces, the big isms, that have really shaped education policy over the last few decades? The source flags up neoliberalism, globalization.
Privatization and marketization, too. Yeah, these are huge influences. Let's take neoliberalism first.
What's the core idea there for students?
Essentially, it's about applying free market ideas to education. Less state control, more competition between schools, treating education like a product, and parents like consumers.
Right, a shift from public service to a market.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
And that underpins a lot of the changes since the 1980s.
Okay. And globalization, how does that connect to schools?
Several ways. One big one is international league tables, like PISA tests.
Ah, yes, the Program for International Student Assessment.
Right. If the UK slips down the rankings, you often get what people call PISA panic.
And that leads to policy changes?
Often, yeah. Quick curriculum reforms, like the push for the the English Baccalaureate, focusing on traditional academic subjects, seen as important globally.
Interesting. Any other global impacts?
Definitely economic. Think about international students and the fees they bring to universities.
Big money there.
Huge. And culturally, too. Globalization pushes discussions about multiculturalism in the curriculum, citizenship, teaching more languages. It all connects.
Tika panic, definitely a term to remember for A-level. Okay, privatization. Sounds controversial. What forms does it take in education?
The source makes a useful distinction here.
Yeah.
There's endogenous privatization
Oh,
happening inside the state system.
yeah.
Schools acting more like businesses, managing their own budgets, competing for students, focusing heavily on performance data.
Okay. And the other type?
Exogenous privatization. That's when external, often private, companies get involved in running things.
Like academy chains,
Yeah.
exam boards, ed tech companies.
Exactly. Services that were once mainly state-run are increasingly provided by private businesses.
And sociologically, what are the arguments around this, the pros and cons?
Well, proponents argue it brings efficiency, maybe drives up standards through competition, offers more choice.
But the criticisms?
Critics worry about the profit motive potentially overriding students' needs. They ask if it increases inequality, creates a two-tier system, and whether quality is always maintained when profit is a factor. Serious sociological questions.
Definitely. And that links directly to marketization, doesn't it? Another key sociological concept.
Absolutely linked. Marketization is the whole process of creating that educational marketplace.
So, encouraging competition, parental choice?
Yes, the idea of parentocracy, parents as consumers choosing schools. And you need mechanisms to make that market work.
Like Ofsted reports, lead tables, national tests.
Exactly. They provide the data for parents to compare schools and make their choices. That's the theory.
But again, sociology offers some pretty sharp critiques here, particularly about who actually benefits.
Precisely. Research consistently shows that middle-class parents will often have more cultural capital, confidence, knowledge of the system, time, resources.
It can play the system better.
They're often better equipped to navigate the choices, research schools, understand catchment areas, maybe even move house to get into a preferred school.
Which can leave less advantaged families.
Potentially stuck with less popular, maybe under-resourced schools. It can widen the gap, lead to more social segregation between schools, and potentially reinforce those covert selection practices we talked about. Plus, less local democratic control over schools is another concern.
It's also interconnected. Understanding these links with neoliberalism, marketization, privatization, and their impact on equality seems absolutely crucial for A-level.
Couldn't agree more.
Now, the source also gives a quick run-through of different governments and their policies. Thatcher, Blair, the coalition. What are the headline shifts students should know?
It's useful to see the timeline. The conservatives from '79 really pushed marketization, giving schools more independence, formula funding, bringing in Ofsted, the national curriculum, testing, setting up that market framework.
Then Labor from '97, did they reverse it?
Not really. They largely continued with market principles, but they put a much stronger emphasis on tackling disadvantage alongside it. So more funding, initiatives like Education Action Zones, EMA for students.
EMA, Education Maintenance Allowance. Yeah.
Specialist schools, too. So marketization plus a focus on equality, you could say.
And the coalition from 2010?
They really accelerated the Academies program, introduced free schools, brought in the pupil premium we discussed, the EBAC, reformed GCSEs and A-levels, often with a real drive towards tougher performance targets and accountability.
So different flavors, different priorities maybe, but some underlying trends persisting.
Exactly. It shows how policy evolves, how the balance shifts. But some of these big ideas like choice and competition have stuck around, albeit in different forms.
Okay. So let's try and pull this together for our A-level listeners. If they take away just a few key things from this deep dive, what should they be?
Right. I'd say first, grasp those 4 dimensions of equality from Gilborn and Udell, access, circumstance, participation, outcome, and understand that tension.
Great.
Especially how policy finds it easier to address access than circumstance.
Got it.
Second, really understand those big forces. Neoliberalism, globalization, privatization, marketization. Know what they mean and how they've shaped the system we have today. That's vital sociological analysis.
Okay.
And third, remember, policies aren't created in a vacuum. They change with different governments, different pressures, and they often have unintended consequences alongside the intended ones.
It really highlights that policy isn't just theory, it shapes real lives, real school experiences.
Definitely.
And achieving genuine equality through policy remains, well, a huge ongoing challenge.
It absolutely does. Which leads to a final thought, really, for you listening, especially as you're studying this for A-level.
Yeah.
Think about the current debates. We still argue about grammar schools, about whether the pupil premium is truly effective, about the growing role of private companies. So, the question for you is, looking at it all through that sociological lens we've discussed, what do you think are the biggest issues facing British education right now? And what kind of policies might actually start to make a real difference, particularly in terms of fairness and equality?
Food for thought indeed. A complex picture, but hopefully this deep dive has helped structure it for your A-level understanding.